This is a webinar with Dr. Doug Tallamy, Professor of Agriculture and Natural Resources in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology, University of Delaware. Dr. Tallamy has authored over 100 research articles and several books, including Nature's Best Hope, a new approach to conservation that starts in your yard, which is one of the main focuses of the following discussion. You don't have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. Here we go.
All right, we're going to launch right in. I want to talk to you about what my idea of nature's best hope is. But before I do that, I want to talk about the wonderful Edward O. Wilson, Harvard emeritus, had a very long, exceptionally productive career at Harvard. But he died the day after Christmas, so it's been a terrible loss to the world of conservation. In 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life, and it was the culmination of a lifetime effort to save biodiversity, to save life on planet Earth. And in this book, he tells us that if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we have to save functioning ecosystems. We have to save nature on at least half of planet Earth. And then he spends most of the book talking about the science that supports that statement. And then the end of the book, he didn't really tell us how we're going to do that. Of course, to conservation biologists, that's a wonderful message. Wonderful. We're going to save life on half of planet Earth, and we'll just be in the other half. The problem is we already have used half of terrestrial Earth for some form of agriculture, and almost 8 billion people in all of our airports and roadways and detritus is in the other half, and we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So how is this going to be possible? That's really what I want to talk about today. I think we can realize E.O. Wilson's dream, but we're going to need a new approach to conservation to do it. Before we talk about that, though, let's talk about what happened on the East Coast in 2019. We had what we call an oak mast, where members of the red oak group got together and decided to make all their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it, and I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a little hole for its head, forced its head through there. Then it forced its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze. Looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy. When it plopped down, it's a very dangerous time for this insect because a lot of things want to eat it. It's very good food. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface. Takes about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa. And then it stays there for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule. And the mouth parts are way down here at the end of that extension. They take those mouth parts, chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around, lay an egg in that hole, and that is how the larva gets into the acorn. Why do they spend 2 years underground? Why don't they come out the next year as most insects would do? Well, it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the very next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns. But of course, once they leave the acorn, there is a hole, a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. In this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils after they have left an acorn. And if scouts find a new hole in a new acorn, they get excited because their old acorn is falling apart. So they tell everybody it is time to move. They grab the larvae, they grab the eggs. The entire colony moves into the new acorn in about 30 minutes. They post a guard there to make sure nobody else comes in. And that's where they'll live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point? That is just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions between animals and plants that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and acorns. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns, pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. You won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have lots of carpenter ants because that's what they rear their young on. You won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have that flower, Facilia, as the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have about 4,000 species of native bees, and they did most of the pollination on well, almost all the pollination in North America before we brought the honeybee over. But more than a third of them are very specialized. They can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plants. So without those plants, those bees disappear. You won't have Baltimore checker spots unless you have white turtlehead. Specialization is the rule in nature. But today, these very specialized relationships, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we didn't take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, stood on the edge, and looked out over its wonderful sight, and he said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave it as it was. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states it's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it. We have drained it. We have grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland, 4.5 times the size of Texas, dedicated to cattle. And of course, we've paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We have drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature, the number of species we need to run the ecosystems that support us. Why have we done this? Well, I don't know, but I suspect we thought the earth, our nest, was so large that we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that. And that's why we're seeing pretty scary headlines like this these days. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America has lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's 1/3 of our North American bird population already gone. Now the UN says we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction in the next 20 years. You know, this is not an option, folks. These are the species that keep us alive, that run our ecosystems. We have to turn this around. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that will involve a number of people, small efforts from a number of people like you and me. But those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what it would mean if Earth lost its insects. And he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, it would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support the animals, our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, our mammals, even many of our freshwater fishes, those food webs would collapse and those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers and all we'd have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. There is some good news here, folks, and that is that none of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are dependent on the life support that ecosystems deliver us. Here are just a few things that plants produce that we need, like oxygen, pretty important. Cleans our water, slows its journey to the sea where it gets too salty to use. Carbon capture, enormously important today. Plants are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, building their tissues out of it, and then pumping the extra carbon into the ground through their root systems. By the way, once it's in the ground, it's stable for thousands of years. Plants build topsoil and hold it in place. They prevent floods. They dampen severe weather. They convert sunlight into food. If we lose our plants, we're going to have to eat sunlight, and that will be difficult. What do animals do for plants? They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today's a terrible idea because we have so many people demanding those services, almost 8 billion people on the planet now. Now we do have parks, we have preserves, but they're too small, they're too isolated, and there's too few of them to produce the amount of services that we need. So now we have to start doing conservation outside of parks and preserves on landscapes like this. There have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth, and Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. And there have been indigenous groups that have been good at doing that. for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area and going to another area doing the same thing. Not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we could develop what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the earth. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed that we could learn to do them gently enough, that we did not destroy local ecosystems. And that's what he called a land ethic. He wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac, his most famous book. What he did not write about, though, was developing a land ethic where we actually live. And I don't know why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have recognized it as an option. Well, what I want to argue this afternoon is that not only is living with nature an option, it's now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head, and we need to save nature, actually reconstruct it where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, not get diminished every year, but thrive. Where should we start? Let's go back to private property. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. If we don't do conservation on private property, we're going to fail. Now, when I talk about conservation, I'm not really using the word correctly. I'm talking about rebuilding nature that we have dismantled. It won't look exactly like it used to, but it still can be functional if we reunite enough of those specialized interactions that I opened the talk with. But there are some building blocks to restoring ecosystems. You have to start with those building blocks or it's not going to work. And there's two groups of species that we can't do without. The flowering plants, and of course, the pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. They are capturing energy from the sun and turning it into the food that drives all of the life on terrestrial Earth anyway. So now we have the energy from the sun in the form of food in plant parts, primarily in leaves. Now we have to get that energy to animals. Most vertebrates don't eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat invertebrates, things like insects that have eaten plants. And it turns out that caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we rebuild landscapes that do not have enough caterpillars in them, we will have failed food webs and again, failed ecosystems. It's a new way of thinking about our landscapes. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That's the bird at our feeders all winter long. Well, chickadees in general, there's several species of chickadees, but 50% of their diet in the wintertime is seeds. The other 50% is insects and spiders, even in the wintertime. But when they're reproducing, their babies can't eat seeds. And that is true for most of the birds that are out there. So they switch to insects. And if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. There's lots of reasons for that we don't have time to go into, but caterpillars drive these bird food webs. Chickadees are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. So the next question is, how many caterpillars do birds need? Let's go back to chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of chickadees? Well, it takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars just to get to the little birds, the fledglings, to the point where they leave the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. So you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars required to make a nest of a bird that's a third of an ounce, 4 pennies worth of bird. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, you've got to have all those caterpillars in your yard, because chickadees only forage about 50 meters from the nest. That's true for most birds. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we don't landscape in a way that produces all of those insects, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like that's directly related to the bird declines that people are measuring. We went to the original data set from Rosenberg et al. That's the Smithsonian group that said we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years, and divided our terrestrial bird species into two groups, the ones that require insects and the ones that do not. Things like doves and finches can reproduce on seeds. They don't require insects. And they didn't lose any numbers at all in the last 50 years. But the birds that require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. This doesn't prove cause and effect, but it does suggest that as you take away bird food, you lose the birds. So let's add a new goal to the goals of landscaping. In the past, we've done one thing. We've tried to make beautiful landscapes. We've thought that plants were just decorations. Plants are decorations, but now we also have to make ecologically functional landscapes, and that won't happen unless we add caterpillars. So how do we do that? We add caterpillars to landscapes by adding the plants that make those caterpillars. Seems pretty easy, but there is a catch, and that is that most plants don't make a lot of caterpillars, so we have to be fussy about it. We have to choose the plants that do, and we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy. And the monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. You won't have any monarch butterflies in your yard unless you have milkweeds. If you've taken out your milkweeds and replaced them with hostas, the monarch is not gonna stick around. That's called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat particular plants. Why are they specialists? Because the plants have made them that way. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they protect their tissues with nasty chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a very effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects around. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Every plant lineage that's out there, and there's a lot of them, protects itself with a unique cocktail of chemical defenses. And an insect can't adapt to all of those. So they pick one or two closely related plants that are protecting themselves in the same way. And they develop the adaptations that get them around those defenses. Specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. But it takes a long time for those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect is locked into eating that plant. So again, if you take the milkweeds out of your yard and replace them with hostas or burning bush or Bradford pear or any other plants that we use in our landscapes from Asia, the monarch's not going to start to eat those things. It's going to either starve or fly until it does find milkweeds. And that's the problem with bringing in plants from other continents. Most of our insects, most of our food webs cannot survive on those plants. And if they escape into our natural areas, and we have 3,300 species of plants that have done that and replaced the native plants, then you've devastated the food web in our natural areas as well as our living spaces. So all I'm saying here is that plant choice matters. If we're going to rebuild food webs, we have to use the right plants or it's not going to work. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it does work when we do choose the right plants, starting with our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. We got a piece of a farm that was broken up in the year 2000. 10 acres had been mowed for hay, so not much there, but we wanted to restore biodiversity here. And you can't do that without returning the caterpillars to the landscape. So this is here are a few examples of how we did that. I wanted to see if I could get the Canadian owlet to our property. I'd never even seen a Canadian owlet, but that's what one looks like. And that's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. You're not going to have Canadian owlets unless you have meadow rue. They're host plant specialists on meadow rue, and we didn't have any meadow rue. So I planted meadow rue. Canadian owlets came right away. Now we have a good population of both meadow rue and Canadian owlets. So we've added 2 species to the property. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That's a misnomer. This beautiful moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It is a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa. There was a power line cut about 14 miles away. I got some Biden's seed there, planted them at home, grew very nicely. Took a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my Biden's, but it did. And now we have a good population of both goldenrod stowaways and Biden's aristosa. Now we've added 4 species to the property. Same story with the hackberry emperor. I wanted the hackberry emperor, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs here. It's one of the creatures that should be in our space. But as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, on celtis. We didn't have any hackberry. Now, all these plants were here hundreds of years ago, but they disappeared with the intensive agriculture. So I planted some hackberry, had to wait 4 years for the butterfly to find my hackberry, but they did. And now we've got a good population of both of those. So now I've added 6 species to the property. And that's how it went. I did not plant goldenrod, came in on its own, but along with it came many of the things that depend on goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcidra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth, planted Virginia creeper. Some people don't like Virginia creeper, but it makes wonderful berries for the birds, good fall color, climbs our trees without pulling them down. It's a good ground cover. I planted it because it supports the large sphinx moth caterpillars that are a primary source of food for cardinals when they're reproducing. Things like the Pandora sphinx. That's its beautiful adult. The lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Wanted to see if I get the evening primrose moth at our house because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. But we didn't have any evening primrose, so I planted it. And the moth came, spends the day with its head stuffed in flowers. It's very cute. And I planted lots of oak trees. Now, those are just examples of the plants that we have put on our property. But I want to spend a little time on oaks because they're such important plants. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is delivering to your local ecosystem, what it's doing for you ecologically in your yard, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, which means they were free. And immediately they started to rebuild the food web by supporting the moths that produce those caterpillars that everybody depends on. Bringing in things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the orange-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crowned bucolatrix, the orange-patched smoky wing, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-lined panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. So immediately your oaks will contribute to your local food web and start to bring nature back to where you're living. This is what our house looks like in the summertime, put a lot of plants back. And 5 years ago now, I started to record by taking pictures of every species of moth that is now making a living at our house. And I'm up to 1,140 species. So far, I still find new ones. Now we've got 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So in 1,240,000ths of the landmass, we're supporting 44% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And because so many of these are types of bird food, we've recorded 60 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is another terrible headline that we see once in a while. The World Wildlife Fund says we've already lost 2/3 of the wildlife from planet Earth. Now they're talking about numbers, not species here. And I'm thinking, not at our house. I'm convinced we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3, and it didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. So don't give up. Don't give up. But I know what you're thinking. We've got 10 acres, and a lot of people don't. Will it work on smaller plots in suburbia? That's a good question. So let's go to Margie and Dan Terpsworth's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres. That's 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. They're in the middle of a suburban development. Everybody has the big lawns. Their yard was choked with bush honeysuckle, another invasive from China. They got rid of that, put in 75 species of native plants, a water feature that they call a bubbler for the birds. And then they sat back and started to count the birds that are using their yard, and they're up to 149 species, including 35 warbler species. Just to put that in perspective, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So can you do it on smaller properties? Absolutely. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago. That's a tower from O'Hare Airport over there. Kennedy Expressway is right over here. She's got 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. She's completely isolated, not connected to any natural area at all. It's a beautiful 1/10 of an acre, but she did the same thing. She got rid of her invasive plants. All invasive plants are non-natives, by the way. put in a water feature, and she sat back, 60 species of native plants too, and she sat back and started to count the birds that are used in her yard. She's up to 124 species so far on her 1/10 of an acre, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, she sent me an email this morning talking about the scarlet tanagers that just stopped by. So does it work on smaller properties? Yes, it does. Okay, there's 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way, and we do want to succeed in a big way. And one of them is we've got to reduce the area that's in lawn. You know, I drove by a church in Mississippi, well, a couple of years ago, I guess. Giant lawn like this. And I'm thinking, you know, everybody goes to the church to worship God's creations inside, but on the outside, they're killing them all. We're not thinking about what places like this do. This is an ecological deadscape. It supports nothing. And we've got 40 million acres of lawn in this country. That's a 2005 statistic, so you know it's more than that. That's the size of New England dedicated to this status symbol. But, I know we need it for a status symbol, but we also need lawns to display our Halloween decorations. But what if we cut that area in half? What if we replanted half the area we now have in lawn? That'll give us 20 million acres. And this is where the Homegrown National Park idea gives up. We can restore 20 million acres at home and create a new national park that would be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park be the biggest park in the country. What do we get when we put a park at home? When we put some part of the natural world where we live, you get the opportunity to develop a personal relationship with Mother Nature. At your own timing, your own pace, all you have to do is go outside. All you have to do is look out your window. You can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park, there are 375 million people there with you last year. So you're really going to a parking lot in an awful lot of cases. It's free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone, which, you know, this is critically important for anybody who wants a relationship with Mother Nature, but especially our kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder, according to Richard Louv. So we're trying. We get 30 kids. We put them on a bus with a teacher. They drive for an hour, go to a natural place, walk around for an hour, and the teacher tells them not to touch anything. And then you get back on the bus and they go home. And that's their exposure to the natural world. It's really been an exposure to 30 other kids and the teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of the natural world at home, all they have to do is go outside and get to know it alone, no parental supervision. Let them develop their own relationship with Mother Nature. This is critically important because they are the future stewards of our planet. If they don't know that they're supposed to steward the planet, if they don't know how to steward the planet, if they don't love stewarding the planet, if they're not terrified of nature the way the media tries to make them, they're going to be lousy stewards, and we can't afford any more lousy stewardship. Second thing we need to do, though, is we take area out of lawn. What plants are we going to put in that space? I'm going to argue that some of them have to be keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is. That's a Roman arch there. The stone, keystone is the stone in the middle of the arch. And if you take that stone out of the arch falls down. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because they are making most of the food. Just 5% of our native plants are making 75% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that hold up that house. They're essential. The house is going to fall down without them. You can't build a house out of wallpaper. And that's what we've been trying to do for the last 100 years. You're not through building your house when you put your keystone plants in, but they're an essential part of it. So the question is no longer simply, are natives better than non-natives? Are contributors better than non-contributors? On average, they certainly are. But do we want to use the native species that support the most pollinators and the most caterpillars or not? That's the question today. What is supporting the most caterpillars? It's one of our oaks. In 84% of the counties in which they occur, oaks are supporting more species of caterpillars than any other tree genus. They're the number one keystone plant. 950 species of caterpillars nationwide, 550 species where I live in the mid-Atlantic states. Extremely important plants. Where do you find out what the other Keystone Plants are where you live, you go to Native Plant Finder, National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of the most important woody and herbaceous plants for your county will pop up. Okay, we're gonna shrink the lawn. We're gonna put in Keystone Plants. We're gonna invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're gonna kill them with our security light, which of course is not the goal. These are all the ways that lights at night kill nocturnal insects, especially those moths that are making those caterpillars that everybody depends on. But you know what? This is good news to me. We have to turn around insect declines. We have already lost 45% of all the insects on the planet, and they're the things that are running the world, remember. If we can turn that around simply by flicking a switch at night, we're getting off easy. But I know what you're going to say. Well, I can't turn the light out over my garage or the bad man will come. All right, put a motion sensor on it. So it only, well, a lot of lights out there, got to turn them out. Put a motion sensor on it so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to realize is the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. A yellow LED is the best because yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to nocturnal insects than our white wavelengths. If we were to replace our white bulbs with yellow bulbs overnight, we would save millions of insects and millions of dollars too, because LEDs are much more energy efficient. Okay, the fourth thing we need to do is think about what caterpillars need to complete their development. They don't just grow on leaves, they have to successfully pupate. So I'm going to give you an example. I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillars eat the leaves, then they spin a cocoon and hang from the tree. Then they emerge as an adult, and then they do it all over again. I wish everything did that, but most of the species don't. 94% of them. 480 species finish growing as caterpillars, and then they drop from the tree and wiggle their way underneath the ground to pupate, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We won't tolerate it. And we mow and compact the soil so it's too hard for any caterpillar to get under. And I'm convinced this is another major cause of insect declines around the country. We create ecological traps when we landscape like this. So this is what most people do. You have a big tree in a yard. We're going to start measuring this summer. I have a new student coming in, exactly how well caterpillars do in a situation like this, but I guarantee they're going to do better here. We have a tree and then a layered landscape, maybe a dogwood, an azalea, ferns, ground cover. Soft landing, the caterpillar drops down. It can easily pupate in the leaves here or get underground, which is not compacted, and survive. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you shrink the lawn. You put beds around your trees, safe sites. Use your native ground covers like wild ginger or mayapple or foam flower or ferns, all wonderful safe sites for those caterpillars. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design taken from a drone 400 feet up. You don't get more formal than that, but every plant in that landscape is a native plant. So formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe every day. I guess it's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a landscape like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Just put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It convinces people that this is not just a patch of weeds that you forgot to mow. It's beautiful when it's in bloom. It's not very big, but if everybody did it, it would help a lot. Why do we need pollinators? It's not because they pollinate our crop. It's because they pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants, including our crops. If we lost our pollinators, we would lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. Not an option. How about this? It's a Drew Latham design, much bigger. Imagine the life supported here versus the amount of life that's supported here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Absolutely. Minnesota kicked it off several years ago with a lawn to legume program, cost sharing program where the state pays people to reduce or replace their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. It's very, very popular. There's an island off Florida that's paying people to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in the front yard. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to take care of it, to be a good steward of it, rather than fine you if you use that property. Everybody would want an endangered species. Water utilities or public utilities are getting into the act, giving people $100 coupons to plant water efficient native plants rather than the thirsty non-natives. And of course, the big lawn reduction programs in different places around the country. California is the biggest one. This has gone up. You get a $3 per square foot rebate if you take out lawn and put in appropriate xeric plantings. California does not have one drop of water to waste on lawns. Okay, we have made 3 missteps, I think anyway, in the early years of conservation. And the first one is a serious one. We've come to think that nature is optional. If it's optional, it's not essential. And if it's not essential, when push comes to shove and resources are in short supply, nature takes a back seat. And you know that resources are always in short supply. Went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there's this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We want to save nature, save wildlife, so that future generations can enjoy it. And I understand that. That was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for making the national park system. They're beautiful places. We're going to save them for future generations to enjoy. But that does suggest that nature's there just for entertainment. No wonder we don't think it's essential. It is essential. We need nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. We've talked about this, but if we restrict conservation only to places where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because there's not enough of those places. David Quammen has a wonderful analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I don't like that language because it suggests there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. There are plenty of places where we've destroyed the significance, but we've got to put it back. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our churches, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even including our agriculture. So we need to glue our rug back together again, folks. We got to put the plants back, not just to make biological corridors that connect those isolated fragments, but to create viable habitat where we've destroyed it, where we live, where we work, where we farm, where we shop, where we play, all of those places. And when we do that, it'll be the first time in modern history that we humans are coexisting with the natural world. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship just to a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, a few ecologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet. But I don't know why, because everybody on the planet, everybody depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystem. So why wouldn't everybody have the responsibility of good Earth stewardship? Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said, the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with these mindsets, you're taught them. We're good at teaching this one. We've been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations to good Earth stewardship. It doesn't mean that you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. You know, right now, so many of us feel powerless. The Earth's problems are huge. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn. One person can put in Keystone Plants. One person can turn out their lights. One person can get rid of the invasive plants that are already on their property. One person can fire Mosquito Joe that's killing everything, not just mosquitoes. There's all kinds of things that one person can do. Put in a pollinator garden. And it shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just think about the piece of the planet that you can influence. If you own property, that's where you start. That's obvious. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a park, preserve, land conservancy. They're all underfunded, all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as property owners or volunteers, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own fate. Now, I think I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. Hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.